Hey friends, here I am. It was a bright sunny Wednesday until about 10 minutes ago, and now it's raining. I was just telling Michelle, a week or so ago, we were all worried that our lawns were going to die, and then we had a tropical storm, and then has it done anything but rain since then? It seems like it's rained every day or two. So isn't that how it goes? Now we get to complain about having too much rain. Here we are still in Matthew. We've worked our way through the Sermon on the Mount. I'm pretty pumped about being able to move on to the next phase. There's a lot of great stuff left to cover. And so we're in chapter 8. And last week we very briefly touched on the neat little story of a leper running up to Jesus and just saying, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus saying, I am willing, and touching the outcast and restoring him, and then sending him to the priest so that he could be officially proclaimed to be clean so that he could rejoin society. There's always a hoop to jump through, you know that. And so here we're seeing a continuation, and I bring that one back up because Matthew likes threes, and it's a biblical thing, in Trinity, So there's a lot of sets of three, and that story about the leper right at the beginning of the chapter is part of another three. So we have the man with leprosy, we've got the faith of the centurion, and then Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. And so we get those three encounters / healings, and then a kind of a summary statement. And we're going to look at this kind of as a piece and think about what the individual stories mean, but also what Matthew is going for, what he's setting up, what's going on in the big picture and contextually. All of it means something, of course. And so we get this leper, should have stayed away, should have been separated from society. Jesus doesn't run from him and in fact touches him and restores him to health. And then, maybe even less likely, an encounter with a centurion. This is verse 5. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came up to him, asking for help. Now this is interesting because the leper didn't ask for anything. If you'll look back at that, he just threw himself down at Jesus' feet, called him Lord, and said, if you're willing, you can make me well. He didn't ask anything. That still kind of amazes me. So this centurion came asking for help, but not for himself, for a servant. Now, just I need to insert this. It is remarkable when someone who is powerful and has access to the trappings of wealth and power, for them to really show a great deal of concern for those under them, especially in this culture, especially in that time in history. Being worried about a slave or servant, it's hard to tell which. But he says in the NIV, my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering. People were kind of disposable back then. And I don't mean that flippantly. As it really, life was cheap, especially to Rome. I mean, they'd run a sword through you as soon as look at you in general. And here, this powerful man, a centurion, that's century, 100. This was a man who was in charge of a large group of soldiers. And if he said jump, they said how high. And so here he is seeking out a Jewish traveling preacher. This is the kind of thing you could get a bad reputation for. You could get ridiculed back at the barracks. So it's really quite going out on a limb for a servant, not for himself. He seeks this guy out. Could have been really humiliating for him socially, but for whatever reason, he sought Jesus out on that servant's behalf. Lord, he said. Again, there's that kind of Christological honorific. It seems to indicate that he got that Jesus was the real deal. Interestingly, Jesus doesn't say, wait, now, are you one of those that has a shelf full of household gods? Are you into Zeus and all of them? He doesn't quiz him, doesn't ask anything about his paganness. It's not even there. There's nothing about that. But He acknowledges Jesus. Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed in terrible suffering. Now this verse 7, this is interesting because it's rendered in the NIV. Jesus said, I will go and heal him. Now remember, the manuscripts that we have didn't have any punctuation. In fact, paper was so scarce and valuable. The people who wrote, especially longer texts, would crunch everything together. The ancient Hebrew, they didn't even have any vowels. We may have talked about that at some point. And it was just all these letters smashed together. And so our translators had to figure out which letters went with what word. There was no indication of where sentences started or began. That's a big challenge. And so in Greek, a little bit of the same kind of stuff. So there's not like question marks and that sort of thing. The commentaries that I've been reading, and again, I'm not strong enough in languages to say if this is true or not, but it's an interesting way to think about it. The one I was reading just a few moments ago contends that this was probably more like a question. And that is largely because in Matthew, Jesus is clearly focused on first to the Jews. Remember, the gospel was first for the Jews and then for everybody else. So he never went out of his way to exclude people of any kind, but he was clearly focused on the Jewish people for his mission. And that makes sense. So, I mean, in Matthew, he doesn't enter a Gentile home at all. So let's just think about it this way. I found this useful. So is it possible, instead of saying, I'll go heal him, Jesus was more like, should I go to your house and heal him? A question. Wondering aloud. Not really coming out and saying, you are Roman. Should I come to your house and heal him? And the man comes through with a spectacular answer. The centurion replied, Lord, I don't deserve for you to come to my house. He got it. Now remember, this guy could have stabbed Jesus in public and walked away and nothing would have happened to him. He could have arrested people. He could have forced them to do forced labor for him. It was a thing. He had a lot of power in that place and in that society. And yet he says, Jesus, I don't deserve to have you come to my house, but listen, just say the word. That's one of my favorite phrases in the Bible. Just picturing this guy saying, just say the word and it's done, because I know authority. I've seen authority. I'm under authority, and if I say to one of my guys, go and do this, they're going to do it. If I can do that, I know you can do it. I know you can. Go back and read that again. It's really amazing. Say the word, and my servant will be healed. I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, he goes. That one, come, he comes. I say to my servant, do this, he does it. And so the subtext is, if even I, unworthy as I am, can wield that kind of authority, then I know you can do it in spades. And he was right. When Jesus heard this, he was astonished and said to those following him, remember there was the crowd and his disciples all kind of together, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Now this is still kind of fairly early in his ministry, but when Matthew, the book, was put together, people would have readily recognized, just the lack of faith in Israel, because they would have known more of the story and the context. Looking at the first 7.5 chapters of Matthew, you wouldn't have a whole lot of evidence of the lack of faith in Israel, but the readers would have known exactly what he was getting at there. I say to you, many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And so there, again, in Matthew, Jesus comes first to the Jews, but there is our proof that he never expected the gospel to end with the Jews. It was always a message for all people. And it was just a little frustrating that it took his followers so long to figure that out. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, these were both very common, traditional Jewish descriptions of the end times. They didn't really have the formulations of hell like we would, but the outer darkness, the place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, and those are very common phrases that you see in the Bible, and that's because those were things that the Jewish people already had in their heads for what it would be like to be on the wrong side of the fence, so to speak, when God started meting out his judgments. And Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, it will be done just as you believed." And his servant was healed at that very hour. Now, interesting, and there's that little, and the servant was healed. See, the focus is not really on the miracle, and that was a miracle. That's amazing, but on the faith. The faith is the key, and I'll circle back on that in a minute. And then we get the third part, and this is just almost kind of a in-passing statement, but it still counts as part of our set of three healings. Jesus came into Peter's house. He saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she got up and began waiting on him. See, fully restored, not just, the fever left, but able to get up and get busy around the house and to take care of things. And when evening came, here's the summary part. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him. And he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and carried our diseases. So, what's the lesson? What are we to learn from this little section of Matthew? The most obvious thing, the thing that just really jumps out when you think of it thematically, is that Jesus is acting, exercising his power on behalf of marginalized and excluded people. You don't see any encounters with upstanding Jewish people, with leaders, with the wealthy. These are people who are pushed to the sides. You know, the centurion particularly, he was a Roman, for goodness sake, who would want to hang out with him? And he was a soldier that actively took a part in the system that oppressed the Jewish nation. So he had a double strike against him. We've got lepers, we've got Romans, we've got soldiers, we've got a woman, at least one, the demon-possessed. You know, they were people that good, normal people kind of avoided and were afraid of. And the sick, of course. And in that culture, if you were unwell, it was assumed that you had some secret sin. That's something, you know, if you don't bear children when you're expected to bear children, God must be mad at you. When you get sick, it's a punishment of some kind. They just assumed that. So we're talking about a very, very quick list of all these different groups that were pushed to the edges of society and perhaps frowned upon, ignored to some extent, or thought lesser of by good, upstanding Jewish people. And so Jesus is reaching them. In some cases, they come looking for him. In the case of at least Peter's mother-in-law, he goes to her. Some are brought, but in all those different ways, people are connecting with Jesus, and he is acting on their behalf. That's important. Do we act on behalf of marginalized and excluded people? We have many ministries that do just that. Are we doing enough? Probably not. Are we being as active as we should be? Probably not. Do we maybe wait until they come and find us too often? Probably so. But Jesus found some, was found by some, and others were brought to him by the community. Are we bringing people to Jesus? Bringing them to get the healing that they need? Just wonder. And of course, you can't miss the emphasis on faith here, particularly when we stick the centurion in the middle there. Now, the leper clearly had complete confidence in Jesus' power. The centurion, see, he really got, and I love the matter of authority. See, he didn't see this as a sickness that needed to be cured. He saw this as a matter of power and authority. And so he seems to be thinking, I mean, he doesn't say it out loud, but he seems to be thinking, there is some power that is paralyzing my servant. There is something causing him pain, and your power is greater than that power. That's what he's saying. Listen, all you have to do is say the word, and it's done, because I know authority when I see it. And so he recognizes that there's different powers, different sources of authority at work in our world. And he knows that Jesus has the ultimate power and authority. That's really important because you may recall at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the crowd, the first thing they're talking about is he has authority. He doesn't say, here's what the book says or here's what tradition says. He's telling us what God wants from us. He's speaking on behalf of God. This is real authority. And these were people who didn't necessarily believe in him, but they heard something that was different. But here was a guy who could say, be clean, and he was clean. His power was greater than the power of that physical ailment. That's real authority. He could say, it will be done, and it was done. He really did just have to say the word. And speaking of word, it says he would drive out the demons with a word. That's real power. He had the power to take up the infirmities of people. And so we see him clashing with the powers of illness and infirmity and the demons that possessed people. And that's important. There's more coming up. But Matthew's kind of giving us a little prelude. He's setting up some things that aren't going to really show up significantly until much later in the story. But see, he's setting up the ultimate conflict. The power of God's kingdom and the power of Satan's kingdom. The things of earth versus the things of heaven. This is a real conflict. We've talked, about, we live where Satan has his reign and he has so much power and the kingdoms and the powers and principalities. There's a lot of words said about that, but we don't often think about the amount of power that evil has in our world. And we don't always consider, like the centurion got, and we should know that Jesus' power is always greater. The power of God's kingdom is always going to win out. Now that doesn't mean that evil has to go away. That doesn't mean if we say, Jesus, I'm praying for this, I know you can do it. We can copy the leper, we can copy the centurion. That doesn't mean it's always going to happen. And I don't want you to over-reduce the lessons here. We can't look at this and say, well, if I prayed for healing and it didn't happen, I must not have had enough faith. And we can't say that if I have faith, I'm going to tell Jesus that this needs to happen and it's going to happen. That's not really the lesson here. He is able. He has the power. He has the authority. Faith is a big part of our connection to him and going to him, but it's not a vending machine kind of thing where it's a simple if-then. You put in a quarter and hit the button and you get what you ask for. It's just not like that. That's not the lesson Matthew's trying to teach us. But we do need to remember, when we see evil winning, when we see infirmity and sickness and paralysis and pain, when we see these things seeming to win, we've got to keep in mind that Jesus gets the last word, and his word is more powerful. His authority is more powerful. If Jesus says the word, it's done. And that's one of the many reasons we study this Bible and we pay a lot of attention to those red letters, because that's Jesus saying the word, And many of those words are designed for us to hear and act upon. And I'd really like for us to be able to say, hey, if Jesus says the word, it's done. I'd like for us to be that kind of church, those kind of disciples. May we continue to study and hear and act on the words of Jesus. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.